the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds have been chipping away at our welfare state, at the mixed economy, and now we've got this war raging in Ukraine with the Russians, which isn't really anything to do with Ukraine. It's two different systems fighting. It's a mixed economy system where the government owns and controls the infrastructure and runs it pretty much at cost for the public. Okay, so there are a few exceptions to that, but basically it's infrastructure government. The government makes sure the railways run, the water runs. And in the West now, we've just got rampant finance capitalism where the political parties, the press, the infrastructure is all being up for sale and to the highest bidder, and sometimes actually sold off at a loss and through all sorts of insider deals and dodgy fraud.
Welcome to the Fair Food Forager and Friends Show, a podcast where we mostly talk about the environment and our health and how they interact with each other, but also some things that you won't hear in the mainstream media. So let's investigate what else is happening, let's hear some alternate views, and let's make up our own minds.
Fair Food Forager.
Changing the way the world eats by making ethical easy.
That sounds like a very good idea.
Fair Food Forager.
To another episode of the Fair Food Forager and Friends Show, the podcast brought to you by the Fair Food Forager app, the world's only ethical social media and sustainable food directory. So you can use this food directory when you're on the road to find ethical and sustainable food. Cafes, restaurants, farmers markets, bulk food stores who are reducing the impact on the planet by reducing waste, food waste, plastic waste, sourcing locally, finding organics, anything like that. And you can also share posts, recipes, food that you're growing, your appreciation of nature, your bushwalk, your beach cleanup, anything that helps each other and the planet. On today's podcast, I'm once again talking to Tony Gosling, and I'm interrupting the little series I have with Michael Wallach on the viral delusion to talk to Tony live from the Bilderberg conference in Portugal for 2023. And as you remember, Tony is a massive wealth of knowledge, remembers all the names and history of these type of elite groups who have basically formed to control the world. And Tony talks about some of the people that might be attending, some of the things that come from past Bilderberg meetings, and what they may have on the agenda for this week's power discussion on how they control our lives, that include war, sending all of us broke, and which politicians they will install in government next. So I encourage you to check out his website, bilderberg.org, to get more of the story and get some of his books as well. So without further ado, here is Tony Gosling. Tony Gosling, welcome again to the Fair Food Forager and Friends Show. How are you?
All right, very well, thank you, Paul. Well, we're getting together just before this 2023 Bilderberg conference over in Lisbon. I think the Portuguese journalists have done a fantastic job this year in literally sniffing them down, hunting them down. So we've got quite a good knowing a lot about the security several days before it convenes this week on the 17th of May 2023. And it's going to be a lot of security at the hotel, several road closures, So just, that's the sort of basics in Lisbon. And I would just encourage anybody, if they hear this, to just get over to Lisbon, because this is where the world's fate about decided. So maybe, you can ask me about that. But these are, I think what we got to do to understand what the significance of this meeting is go back to Washington last year. I mean, obviously, you can go right the way back and look at all the history of the Bilderberg, including the enormous amount of evidence of this being really essentially a Nazi project in collaboration with the Allies at the end of the war. So, there was all these kind of statements at the end of World War II. General Patton coming out quite openly and saying, let's just go and attack Russia, the Soviet Union as it was at the time. Let's just plough onto Moscow. Then he had a nasty little car crash. We also have Winston Churchill trying to get onto any live program on the BBC in the late 1940s, saying how important it was to use these newfound nuclear weapons to obliterate Moscow, and having to be kept off any live programs on the BBC as a result, as he was, of course, before he became famous and before he became Prime Minister. The 1930s, Churchill, although he was making a lot of fuss about Adolf Hitler, was kept well away from the microphones until appeasement was over, until he became Prime Minister in 1940. So, a lot of connection with the Nazis, a lot of connection with Russophobia. Last year, they put the Ukraine issue at the bottom of the agenda in a rather cheeky fashion. Of course, it's the top agenda. It's the most important item that the Bilderbergers are because, as we know about their involvement in the Iraq War, the Yugoslav breakup of the Balkanization of the Balkans, if you want, the destruction of Yugoslavia, all these things which are geopolitical, the Bilderbergers have been involved in one way or another. And if you go back through, I can remember 2002. What do you mean you're going to be attacking Iraq? What these were the leaks coming out of the conferences, and of course the rest is history. So this is a military alliance. It's really a kind of political wing of NATO. Over the years, they have been pushing for specific people to be heads of state, prime ministers, etc. Now, I think it's impossible to become either a prime minister or a head of state in the political world in the NATO countries without the Bilderbergers' approval. So their favourite trick is to just make sure that whoever the two rival parties are, that they control both. I think it's also really interesting looking at this weekend's Turkish elections, and it certainly looks as if Recep Tayyip Erdogan is going to be he's going to be re-elected. So that means that Turkey will be straddling the East-West divide between Russia and NATO. Whereas if the opposition had done very well, then it would have been a little bit maybe, well, not quite like the Nazi Ukraine, but there would have been more rapprochement with NATO. It's a very interesting situation that the Turks are in, and so Bilderberg, just in a nutshell, is the really the political wing of NATO. And I used to think of it as the lobby, really, but it isn't now. It's the people there are absolutely solid, and this was always the mission of Bilderberg since the 1950s, to put their people in power in Europe, particularly, and it's a US-British led thing with a lot of Germans involved, a lot of ex-Nazis, bowled up at the very first Bilderberg meetings with their suits on and everything, hoping that no one would be able to trace the role that they'd had in World War II, including confiscation of Jewish wealth, the financial direction, the propaganda ministry, all the anti-Semitic and other anti-Slavic, the racist lies that went with this whole Nazi mythology, promulgated by the people at the original Bilderberg conferences, which was dug out by a guy called Manfred Petrich. He ran a thing called the All Smoke and Mirrors blog, and some of his old posts are still there, but he died about a year and a bit ago. And he was one of the people we used to love meeting with at Bilderberg. So sad he's no longer around. But his German language critique was some of the best in the world of what these guys are up to. And he was absolutely clear about this being a Nazi operation, a Fourth Reich operation. And so am I. In fact, I've done a book about that, which is looking at it's called The Traitors of Arnhem, Martin Bormann and the Bilderberg Group, and looking at building on the work, really, of Paul Manning, the former CBS journalist who was the author of Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, and the other author is John Ainsworth Davis, a.k.a. Christopher Crichton, the author of Op JB, who really just put together the story of what happened at the end of the war with the British